Vimanas. Vedic text dating back to 16,000 BC talks about Indian civilization having access to flying machines called Vimanas.
Most people assume artificial intelligence only predicts the future. But what happens when it starts uncovering secrets from the distant past? When Grok AI analyzed ancient Sanskrit texts describing mysterious flying machines, it found repeated clues that challenged long-held assumptions. Then, it identified one pattern hidden across multiple manuscripts that nobody had noticed before. And that's where the real mystery begins. The machine that read the forbidden texts. In late 2025, something happened that Sanskrit scholars had quietly dreaded for years. Grok, the artificial intelligence built by Elon Musk's XAI, was fed some of the oldest manuscripts ever written by human beings. Ancient Sanskrit texts describing flying machines called Vimanas. And it did something no human scholar had ever dared to do. It refused to treat them as poetry. For more than a century, every academic who opened these texts arrived with the same assumption already installed in their head, that descriptions of flying palaces and aerial chariots were religious metaphors, beautiful mythology about gods who move through the heavens. Grok carried no such assumption. It processed the passages the same way it would process a leaked engineering document, extracting terminology, measurements, materials, and operational parameters. And what came back stunned the people watching. The reports described findings that should not exist. The AI had flagged a propulsion system that burned no fuel, described in the texts as drawing power from the interaction between specific materials and layers of the atmosphere. It had flagged navigation methods based on sensitivity to unseen forces running through the Earth. Language eerily close to magnetic field guidance, a concept nobody in the ancient world was supposed to possess. It had flagged a list of roughly 17 construction materials whose described properties matched nothing in modern materials databases. And most disturbing of all, it had flagged operational limitations. Altitude ceilings, seasonal performance changes, conditions under which the craft could not fly. Gods do not need altitude ceilings. Music engineering does. One detail above all set the internet on fire. Buried in the epic literature, the analysis reportedly found a passage describing how the Earth appears round and bounded when seen from a very great height. Sit with what that would mean for a moment. A civilization with no aircraft, no balloons, and no towers taller than a temple, casually recording what our planet looks like from above. The flying machines described inside these reports are real descriptions written by real hands. There is a physical Sanskrit text held in Indian archives that reads like an aircraft manual complete with pilot music, diets, cockpit mirrors, alloy recipes, and engineering drawings. 5 scientists at India's most elite aerospace institution once considered it serious enough to place on formal trial. A researcher at a major university later claimed he pulled one of its impossible alloys out of a modern furnace and watched it behave exactly as the text promised. And a medieval Indian king wrote down a mercury-based propulsion concept 900 years before NASA fired Mercury engines in orbit. So the question is no longer whether the story sounds insane. The question is how deep the real trail goes. Because the final answer to what Grok actually found is not what you expect, and it is waiting in the last chapter. The trail does not begin with an AI. It does not even begin in ancient India. It begins in a small town near Bangalore in the early 20th century with a dying man who fell into a trance and began dictating an aircraft manual. He had no earthly business knowing how to write. The man who dictated a flying machine manual. His name was Pandit Subir Shastri, and his story begins long before anyone ever heard the words by Menkachastra. If his own account is true, His early life was filled with tragedy almost beyond belief. Born during the 1860s in what is now Karnataka, India, he entered the world with almost nothing. His family struggled with extreme poverty, and before he reached adulthood, disaster struck again. Smallpox swept through the region, killing several members of his family and leaving him completely alone. The disease itself nearly claimed his life as well. With no home, no money, and no one left to care for him, he wandered from place to place, surviving however he could. According to his own writings, there came a point when he collapsed in a forest, weak from hunger and illness, convinced that he was about to die. That was when he claimed everything changed. Shastri later said that a wandering holy man discovered him in the forest, nursed him back to health, and introduced him to spiritual practices that awakened abilities he never knew he possessed. After this encounter, he believed he began receiving messages from the ancient sage Herda, one of the legendary rishis mentioned in ancient Indian traditions. Shastri insisted throughout his life that these messages were not his own thoughts. Instead, he claimed the sage communicated directly through him, revealing knowledge that had been forgotten for thousands of years. Whether anyone believed him or not, he never changed that story. Between 1918 and 1923, something extraordinary reportedly happened. During long trance-like sessions, Shastri would begin speaking in fluent technical Sanskrit. Witnesses claimed his voice and manner changed completely while he dictated page after page of highly detailed material. There was one remarkable problem with this. Shastri himself had never received the advanced scholarly education needed to produce such complex Sanskrit literature. He was not known as an engineer or scientist, yet the words continued to flow with astonishing consistency. A devoted assistant named G. Venkatachala Sharma carefully sat beside him through these sessions. For years, Sharma wrote down every sentence exactly as Shastri spoke it, filling notebook after notebook by hand. Eventually, these writings became a manuscript called the Vimanas Shastra, often translated as the science of aeronautics. Shastri never claimed he had written the work himself. Instead, he repeatedly said he was only acting as a messenger for Bharadvaja, who he believed was revealing fragments of an ancient text that had once contained far greater knowledge. The contents of the manuscript are what transformed the story from an unusual spiritual claim into one of history's most controversial mysteries. Rather than discussing mythology or philosophy, the text focused almost entirely on machines that resembled flying vehicles. It described 32 different secrets related to flight and introduced 4 distinct aircraft called the Shakuna, Sundara, Rukma, and Trora. Each supposedly possessed unique designs, construction methods, and capabilities. The manuscript also explained what pilots should eat before flying, what clothing they should wear, and even how they should prepare their minds and bodies before operating these machines. The technical descriptions became even more surprising. The text listed around 17 different metals and alloys, including one called Tamagarba Loha, along with detailed recipes describing ingredients, mixing ratios, furnace temperatures, and manufacturing procedures. Other sections described mirrors designed to concentrate solar energy, devices intended to observe enemy aircraft from great distances, smoke-producing mechanisms for concealment, and equipment that sounded remarkably similar to reconnaissance systems. In 1923, a skilled draftsman named T.K. Alappa worked closely with Shastri, converting these verbal descriptions into detailed engineering drawings complete with cross-sections and mechanical layouts. After the manuscript was completed, it quietly disappeared from public attention. Shastri died in 1941, still living modestly and maintaining until his final days that none of the ideas belonged to him. The notebooks remained largely unknown for more than a decade as they passed through private hands. Then in 1952, scholar G.R. Josier publicly announced the existence of the manuscript, drawing attention from researchers and journalists alike. Interest continued to grow until 1973, when Josier published the first complete English translation in Mysore. The timing could hardly have been more dramatic. Around the world, books about ancient astronauts and lost civilizations were becoming incredibly popular, and many readers immediately saw the Vimanas Shastra as possible evidence that advanced technology might have existed in the distant past. It is easy to dismiss stories involving transdictation. Many people certainly did. Yet, one fact kept drawing attention back to the manuscript. Here was a man with no recognized engineering background speaking in an era when powered flight itself was barely beginning, producing descriptions detailed enough that professional aerospace engineers eventually decided they deserved a serious technical evaluation rather than simple ridicule. In 1974, 5 scientists from India's leading aeronautical institute conducted exactly that investigation, believing careful engineering analysis would finally settle the question. Instead, their conclusions ignited a debate that has continued for more than half a century, and what they discovered remains one of the most fiercely argued chapters in the entire Vimanas Shastra story. 5 scientists put the Vimanas on trial. The Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore is one of India's most respected scientific institutions. It is not a place known for entertaining myths or chasing legends. It is where generations of engineers have helped develop advanced aircraft, satellites, space missions, and defense technology. That is exactly why the next chapter in the Vimanas Shastra story became so important. For the first time, the manuscript would not be judged by historians or spiritual scholars. It would be examined by professional aerospace scientists whose entire careers revolved around one simple question: could any of these machines actually fly? In 1974, that investigation finally happened. A team of 5 researchers led by aerospace scientist H.S. Mukunda carried out a detailed technical analysis of the manuscript. Their work, titled A Critical Study of the Work Vimanas Shastra, was published in the journal Scientific Opinion. More than 50 years later, it is still regarded as the single most influential scientific assessment ever written about the mysterious text. Rather than dismissing it after a quick glance, the researchers carefully examined every major design, every proposed aircraft, and every description of propulsion and construction. Their conclusions could hardly have been more direct. According to the team, none of the aircraft described in the manuscript possessed the characteristics required for real flight. The designs ignored fundamental principles of aerodynamics, balance, and structural engineering. One sentence from the report became especially famous. The researchers described the aircraft geometries as unimaginably horrendous from the point of view of flying. It was an unusually strong criticism coming from scientists who normally wrote in careful, measured language. The Rukma Vimana became one of their clearest examples. The manuscript described a towering vehicle with multiple stacked music sections and elaborate internal chambers. On paper, it sounded magnificent. From an engineering perspective, however, the scientists argued that such a structure would be dangerously unstable. The enormous weight distribution combined with its proposed shape would prevent controlled flight and could even cause the craft to fail under its own stresses before ever leaving the ground. Similar problems appeared throughout the manuscript. The propulsion systems conflicted with established physics. The control mechanisms lacked practical explanations, and many technical claims simply could not work as described. For many observers, the report appeared to settle the debate once and for all. If India's leading aerospace experts rejected the aircraft design so completely, surely the mystery was over. But something unexpected happened during their analysis. While the researchers strongly criticized the flying machines, they did not dismiss every part of the manuscript. One section continued to attract their attention, and that section dealt with metallurgy. Unlike the aircraft descriptions, the recipes for metals and alloys displayed an unusual level of internal consistency. The manuscript carefully listed ingredients, mixing proportions, furnace designs, heating times, cooling methods, music, and the expected properties of the finished materials. Instead of sounding like mythology, these passages read more like instructions from an experienced metal worker. Even Mukunda's team acknowledged that this aspect deserved separate investigation. Destroying impossible aircraft designs with scientific analysis was relatively straightforward. Explaining why a supposedly transdictated manuscript contained detailed metallurgical procedures was a far more difficult question. The report also contained another observation about the manuscript itself, one that many readers overlooked at the time. It did not immediately solve the mystery, but it raised new questions about when the text may have been written and how its contents had been assembled. That particular finding would become one of the most controversial parts of the entire investigation, but its full significance only becomes clear after following the rest of the story. After the study was published, public opinion split even further. Believers argued that the scientists had approached the manuscript with modern assumptions and therefore misunderstood ancient technology. Skeptics accepted the report as final proof that the Vaikika Shastra was nothing more than a modern creation. The debate slowly faded from public attention, and once again, the manuscript returned to libraries and archives where it gathered dust. For decades, almost nothing changed. Then a researcher at Banaras Hindu University decided to ignore the aircraft entirely and focus on something much smaller. Instead of trying to build a flying machine, he chose to recreate one of the manuscript's mysterious alloys exactly as the ancient instructions described. What emerged from that furnace would revive a debate many believed had already ended. The alloys that refused music to stay fiction. The researcher's name was Naren Gopal Dangar, and his claim remains one of the most uncomfortable footnotes in this entire story. Working with colleagues and drawing on the Vimanas Shastra, along with a related channeled text called the Amsu Badini, Dangreed that he had successfully produced Tamagarba Lawa, a dark lead-based alloy, that the manuscript literally names a womb of darkness, a material said to swallow light. According to his account, the finished alloy really did display unusual light-absorbing behavior, and he presented it to the world as evidence that these texts preserved fragments of genuine lost knowledge. Think about the position that puts us in. A text dictated by a man in a trance, condemned as aeronautically worthless by 5 elite scientists, apparently containing at least one metallurgical recipe specific enough to be followed in a modern laboratory and produce a working result. Dangar's claim had been misunderstood. Either the recipe was a lucky accident or knowledge had entered that manuscript through some channel nobody has identified, and neither option lets you sleep particularly well. Now, in fairness to you, I have to add the caution that serious scientists add. Dangreed's work was never replicated by independent laboratories and never appeared in leading materials journals. And chemists point out that a dark lead alloy absorbing light is achievable through ordinary chemistry, which means a text dictated in the early 20th century could have absorbed metallurgical knowledge already circulating through colonial India. The claim sits in a kind of limbo, too weak to prove anything, and too specific to fully dismiss. And that limbo is exactly where it has remained for decades while almost nobody talks about it. But here is what genuinely gets under my skin. And it is the piece of context that reframes the entire mystery. If you go hunting for astonishing Indian material science, you do not actually need a Ch-Neld manuscript because the verified archaeological record is already staggering. The Iron Pillar of Delhi has stood exposed to 1,600 years of rain and refuses to rust, protected by a phosphorus-rich crystalline layer that modern metallurgists only fully decoded in the late 20th century. Wootz steel forged in southern India more than 2,000 years ago was so superior to anything else on Earth that it became the legendary Damascus steel of medieval swords. And recent electron microscopy has revealed carbon nanotubule-like structures hiding inside surviving blades. At Zawir in Rajasthan, Indian metallurgists were industrially distilling zinc centuries before Europe even understood that such a process was possible. Whoever composed the Vimanas Shastra was writing inside a civilization whose real furnaces had outperformed the world for 2,000 years. And that fact will matter enormously when we reach the end of this road. For decades, all of this remained a quiet academic argument confined to journals and seminar rooms where it could embarrass nobody. Then in January of 2015, the Vimanas broke out of the archive, seized the main stage at the largest science gathering in India, and triggered a national scandal that reached all the way to NASA the day ancient aviation hijacked a science congress. The 102nd Indian Science Congress opened in Mumbai in January of 2015, with Nobel laureates on the speaker list and the Prime Minister himself in attendance. The annual gathering was expected to highlight the latest scientific discoveries and encourage serious academic discussion among researchers from across the country and abroad. Buried inside the official program was a session on ancient sciences through Sanskrit. And in that session, a retired pilot training instructor named Captain Anand Bodhis stood before a hall full of professional scientists and announced that ancient India had mastered aviation thousands of years before the Wright brothers ever left the ground, leaving many attendees stunned. He did not stop at modest claims, and this is the moment the room began to shift uncomfortably in its seats. Bodhis declared that ancient Vimanas were enormous music, craft capable of traveling between countries, between continents, and even between planets. He cited 40 kinds of engines attributed to the sage Haruaja and described aircraft that could move in any direction at will. These were exactly the statements that had circulated in fringe paperbacks for decades, except now they were being delivered under the official banner of Indian science at the country's most prestigious scientific gathering with the world watching. The backlash was immediate and ferocious. Ram Prasad Gandhi Raman, a scientist working at NASA's Research Center, launched an online petition demanding the session be canceled, and it gathered signatures from researchers around the world within days. He warned that mixing mythology into a science congress would humiliate serious Indian scientists on the music global stage. Inside India, the most cutting response came from Radham Narasimha, one of the country's most respected aerospace scientists, and a man who had devoted his career to documenting real Indian aviation history. His position was withering in its simplicity. The Vimana texts had already been examined by qualified scientists decades earlier, and dressing them up as settled history insulted the genuine achievements of Indian science. What fascinates me most about this episode is not the spectacle itself, but what it reveals about all of us. By 2015, the Vimana had stopped being a manuscript question and had become an identity question tangled up in national pride and the very human ache to believe that our ancestors were giants. Scholars like Murananda have documented in detail how these claims became political currency, a shortcut to borrowed glory that skips the harder work of celebrating what ancient India verifiably achieved. And once belief becomes identity, evidence stops mattering, which is precisely how this subject kept climbing out of its grave decade after decade, no matter how many experts buried it. Throughout that entire scandal, one name kept surfacing on both sides of the fight: music, wielded like a weapon. Believers invoked him as their crown witness, a decorated and honored scholar who supposedly proved the Vimanas were real. That man had been dead for 36 years by the time the Congress convened, and what he actually wrote is not what either side wanted to hear. The scholar everyone quotes and nobody reads. Dr. V. Raghavan was the real thing. He was a professor of Sanskrit at the University of Madras, the author of more than 100 scholarly works, and a recipient of the Padma Ban, one of the highest civilian honors the Indian Republic can bestow. When ancient aviation believers need credibility, this is the name they reach for, usually attached to the claim that he proved ancient Indians flew. So I went digging for what he actually published. And the reality turned out to be far more interesting than the legend built on top of him. In 1956, Raghavan wrote a study called Yantras, or Mechanical Contrivances in Ancient India, and it is a genuinely wonderful piece of scholarship. He documented the machines that ancient Indian texts really do describe: water clocks, automata, war engines, mechanical birds, and yes, the long literary tradition of our aerial cars. He argued that these references revealed a real ancient fascination with mechanism and deserved serious study rather than dismissive laughter. What he never did was claim that functioning aircraft existed in ancient India. His careful academic curiosity was inflated after his death in 1979 into an endorsement he never gave. And that quiet distortion tells you everything about how this legend feeds itself. The ancient texts he studied deserve the same honest reading, and they reward it richly. The Pushpaka Vimana of the Ramayana is genuinely described in loving detail. A magnificent aerial palace that the demon king Rana stole from his half-brother Kuber, and that Rama later rode home in triumph from Lanka to Ayodhya. The verses speak of a shining structure that moves at the speed of thought, filled with golden pillars, crystal windows, and gardens blooming in midair. The Rigveda, composed over 3,000 years ago, sings of the chariot of the Ashvins crossing the sky, and of the Ribis who crafted a flying car for the gods. The Mahabharata gives us Sabha, the flying city of King Shava, which hovers over battlefields and vanishes at will, and it describes aerial duels that believers love to read as ancient dog fights. The word Vimana itself carries a quieter secret that most videos never mention, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. In the earliest Sanskrit, it simply meant something measured out or traversed. Then it came to mean a palace, then the towering shrine above a temple sanctum. Only in the modern era did it settle into meaning aircraft. And in today's Hindi, Vimana is literally the everyday word for an airplane. Across 3,000 years, a poetic flying palace slowly transformed into a piece of aerospace engineering, not inside the texts, but inside the minds reading them. And yet, buried in this same tradition in a treatise written by an actual historical king rather than a poet or a trans medium, there is one passage that refuses to dissolve into poetry, and it names a specific liquid metal as the beating heart of a flying machine, the Mercury machine. And what Grok really found: King Bhoja of Dhra was not a legend, and he was not a CH-nelled voice. He was a real monarch who ruled in central India in the 11th century, a warrior who also stood among the great scholar patrons of the medieval world. Among the works attributed to his court is the Samarangana Sutrahara, a massive Sanskrit treatise on architecture and engineering. and tucked inside it sits the passage that has haunted this subject for 100 years. The text describes a flying machine shaped like a great bird built from light wood fitted with a container of mercury and a heated iron apparatus beneath it. When the mercury is set into motion by fire, the verses say the machine rises into the sky and travels a great distance. Unlike the divine chariots of the epics, this description offers components, materials, and a sequence of operation. And the text even admits that music's certain construction details are deliberately kept secret. Now, let me tell you the part that made me put my notes down and stare at the wall. In the 1960s and 1970s, when American engineers built the first ion propulsion systems ever flown in space, the propellant they chose was mercury. The SER-UNM mission in 1964 and CERT-2 in 1970 carried engines that ionized mercury vapor to produce thrust, and CERT-2 fired successfully in orbit for thousands of hours. The record stands in NASA's own archives. The first fuel humanity ever used for electric propulsion in space was the same strange liquid metal that an Indian king had named as the heart of his flying machine. 9 centuries earlier. The physics share nothing since heated spinning mercury will never lift a vehicle. But the intuition is breathtaking. Out of every substance in the medieval world, the tradition fixated on the one metal that would eventually push real machines through the vacuum of space. Music, which brings us finally to the question this entire journey has been circling. What did Grok AI actually find when it read these texts? And here is the anticlimax. The truth I have been holding since the first chapter. It found nothing because the analysis never happened. There is no EPXAI research program on Sanskrit manuscripts, no paper, no announcement, and no terrified researchers, only ordinary users pasting Vimana passages into a chatbot and content creators dressing the screenshots up as a secret study. The famous passage about the earth appearing round from above does not exist in the Mahabharata in any form scholars can locate. It was invented and stitched onto an ancient epic. And the finding I withheld from the 1974 report is the blade that cuts deepest of all. Mukunda's team dated the Vimanas Shastra through its language, its measurements, and its documented history to between 1900 and 1922. The great ancient aircraft manual was composed in Shastri's own lifetime. Born in his trances, music, not in the Vedic age. So the viral story collapses. And yet, strangely, the real story stands taller in the wreckage. A dying man dictated an aircraft manual he should not have been able to imagine. Elite scientists demolished it and still left its metallurgy unexplained. A researcher claimed he pulled its darkest alloy out of a modern furnace. A science congress fell to the myth in front of Nobel laureates. A revered scholar was quoted for 50 years by people who never read him. And a medieval king named Mercury as the fuel of flight 9 centuries before NASA music proved him accidentally right. The legend survives not because the evidence is strong, but because the longing is, and the tragedy is that ancient India never needed the borrowed glory. The civilization that gave the world its numerals, forged steel Europe, could not copy for 1,000 years, and raised an iron pillar the rain cannot rust was extraordinary in ways still barely known. Thousands of genuine manuscripts sit undigitized in Indian libraries waiting for real researchers with real methods. And when every page is finally read, we will know at last the difference between what our ancestors built and what they dreamed. I intend to be standing right here when that day arrives. So tell me honestly in the comments, do you believe these texts preserve the memory of something real or the most detailed dream in human history? Share your thoughts below and subscribe so you never miss what we uncover.